Hello, thank you for watching, and today we're going to talk about writing better code with typed entity. Before we dive in, I am Mateo. I work for Lullabot. We are Drupal agency. We work for large-scale publishers, and we offer strategy, design, and development services. And I go by EOIPSA. You can find me by that username in Drupal.org and in GitHub. You can find me in Mastodon. And if you are so inclined, check out mateoaguilo.com. That's my personal website. I post things about Drupal and technology, privacy, and I post my thoughts there. Or you can even go to the Lullabot website and find my bio. So what takes me to this presentation is that I have been experiencing this kind of dilemma lately that Drupal projects can be challenging, and coding them, therefore, it can be daunting because you need to know a lot of Drupalism or framework specific concepts like content type, plugins, services, tagged services. When do you use one? Then you need to know that to extend Drupal's functionality, you need to implement hook or maybe write service subscribers, events subscribers, sorry, etc., etc. But we want to do we want to get all that complexity, and especially in our business logic, we want to be able to do what we need. And this presentation is all about the business logic. So in your typical Drupal install, if the Acme Corporation was to come to you and offer you a project and you were to help them carry on that project using Drupal, you would have a part of your code base being the framework, Drupal with contrib, core, etc., maybe some theme on it, and then you have your business logic, which is the logic that you custom build for your customer or for the business, right? And those are things that are typically not shareable, things that you wouldn't be able to carry around and from project to project. And as I said before, we want to do all that. We want to own all that complexity because complexity is the feature. We are tasked to build complex systems for clients that have nuanced needs, and we need to translate that complexity in the business and how they operate into their digital properties. And that is a good thing. We are, or Drupal is very good in handling that, but that complexity needs to be contained. Otherwise, you may end up with a highly costly code base to maintain. So it takes a lot of money to maintain that code base because there is so much complexity and it's difficult to know what's going on. And I'm gonna propose that there is a better way to organize your code so it's more maintainable and therefore cheaper to maintain moving forward, and that is using a module that I wrote that is called typed entity. And so the idea is kind of goes like this. You, instead of putting all of your logic inside of a myriad of hooks, depending on what you want to do, if it's altering a form, or it's maybe implementing a hook for access, or maybe you want to operate with something related to an entity inside of a service, you don't put the logic there in those places. You put it close to the entity. You create a class that represents an entity type and bundle. In this case, it's a node and it's of type book. And in there, you put all the logic that you need, right? And you can even work with relationships in there. And then you, instead of returning a node, you return one of these classes, like in this case, the author returns another class called person that is not exactly a node, but it contains a node. If you see like towards the top, this class contains an entity. So, and you operate on that. So all the business logic related to a book will be contained in this class. So anything that goes to an entity of the type node of the bundle book goes into here. And then in your hooks, services, plugins, whatever, you just call those methods, and your code is much cleaner. And so with this just super simple 1 minute explanation, you can get the idea that you put all the business logic regarding to the book into the book class, and then in the service you put the logic that is pertaining to the service, right, and not to the book itself. So another hint is that if you are accessing field data from anywhere that is not the book class or the whatever class, it's a red flag indicating that you need to put it in what it's called an entity wrapper. And bear in mind that this only applies to entities. That's why it's called typed entity. But even though this won't help you organize your code site-wide or all of your code, I would argue that entity types are the main integration point for custom business logic. So you are probably covered, I don't know, 80-90% of the time with this approach with typed entity. So why entities? Well, entities have many responsibilities. We use them for many purposes, and that is good. We should keep using them in such capacities. We render them as content in the screen. We use them for navigation purposes to attach SEO metadata that is relevant for when we put the page in a browser, and we decorate those with we add hints for decorative purposes. We use them to indicate that these and that entities should be grouped together when doing a listing. We use them to embed them in WYSIWYGs. We treat them in many different ways, and I haven't listed all of the possibilities that we can do. So it is this concept, it is not unique, and there is even a core patch that is aiming towards having, when you do node load 12, now you always get the node class, right? And that is independently of the type of the node, right? And with this patch we'll do, and it really looks like it's going to land, is that you will be able to specify, all right, for the type book, get this class, right? And when you do node load 12, it will return you an instance of that class. And that is exactly what the bundle override module was doing before. And by the way, seeking a co-maintainer. So if you are interested and want to step up, you can go to that ECQ and offer your help. The things that I don't like about that approach are that first, it increments the API of the entity objects. So what that means is that when you do node load, now it returns a node, and with that patch in the future, you will be able to say, no, it returns a book, and then add some methods to the book class. But it will still be extending from the node, meaning that you will now have in the book class all of the methods of the node plus your custom methods. But your custom methods are going to be custom, and it's going to be possible, I was going to say likely, but maybe it's just going to be just possible that in the future that you have your custom code written, you update Drupal, and one of the new methods that were included into the node class now collides with your custom logic that you implemented in the book, right? So that is kind of a risk that maybe worth taking. I think that this patch is really step forward and we need it, and it's completely compatible, and it will even forward the process of the identity. But I don't think that is really enough. And extending the surface of the entity objects will also make testing more complex, because you inherit all of the storage, all of the you inherit a lot of stuff with it. While if you just compose it with your entity, as we saw in the early example about the book class, that problem goes away. Another issue that I have with this approach is that this only solves the problem partially, and that is because many times we want to have, depending on the actual content on the entity, we will want to have like maybe an audiobook class, a one that has a custom business logic, a method that tells you how to build the S3 URL that contains the MP3 for the audiobook, or maybe it's a sci-fi book and that has different business logic attached to it. And yeah, that's something that this particular approach will not allow, while temp entity fosters or encourages you to go with those patterns. And finally, it makes the framework logic that we saw in that slide with black and red backgrounds, it makes the framework logic bleed into the application logic. And that is breaking the separation of concerns. And it's a problem because now you're carrying around all this complexity that comes from the framework that should be tested there and should be left alone. It's now in your application code, and you somehow own part of that complexity, and that doesn't make your code more maintainable. And that's what we are aiming for: better maintainability and more quality for a cheaper price. The approach of typed entity is it goes like this. You create a plugin and you say that this plugin is for entity type node and bundle book, right? And then you just extend from a base class and you're done. And that is called a type repository, because that is not dealing with a specific entity. It's just dealing with the entity type and bundle. And in there, what you will put is logic that doesn't apply to a specific instance of a book, right? But you would put something like find books tagged with whatever, and then you pass the name of a tag, or maybe logic that applies to many books at the same time, or no book at the same time, like a create method, or maybe a bulk operation that you do to many nodes. And that plugin in its annotation will have the name of the class. Remember that we had a book class at the beginning. Now it's where we put where we connect the dots, where we connect node and book, entity type and bundle with the class that it needs to instantiate through that annotation. We'll see an example in a moment. So the plugin is called the type repository because it's a repository of wrapped entities, and then each instance of it is a wrapped entity. So think of a repository like this big rectangle, and you pass in a node like this small rounded corner squares. Each one of these represents a node with NID 32, 12, 44, and you pass it to the book repository and it creates a book object. And more interestingly, you can pass it to a helper function that inspects the entity. It sees that it's a book, it finds that there is a book repository for it, and then it uses the book repository to give you the the book class. And then the book class, you can, as we saw earlier, you can implement the author method, the loan, or the method to generate the table of contents. And the green check marks there indicate that you can test these, right? It is easy. You just mock your entity, which is a dependency, the underlying entity, the underlying node. You mock it and you cover all of the cases where, or the special values of content, or if it's empty or not, stuff like that. You can mock that via testing, and you're done, right? You can even go a little bit further and implement customly defined interfaces, and that is another key concept. So if you're taking away anything of this presentation, maybe think of this. Declare the capabilities or your book class through interfaces. So later on, you can detect, can this class be a book, be whatever, be a audio recording, be an event or whatever. Does this support this capability that I have declared as a customly defined interface? And if yes, then do this. If not, maybe ignore it or do that, right? But that would be the place. So the rectangle with wavy lines represents the book, and the solid red rectangle represents the repository. And as we said, the repository also, a part of being the factory for creating these book objects, it also has responsibilities of its own, like maybe find all of the books by genre, and it returns you book objects and not node objects. So this presentation is called Write Better Code. So let's see some more code, right? But before we do that, remember that with this, we are trying to achieve some of the solid principles of maintainable code, but we are also trying to balance pragmatism in this approach. We are trying to be practical about it because of how Drupal works, and because of you're integrating inside of a Drupal application, there are some trade-offs for developer experience that we're going to be making. So if you are super into solid patterns and solid design, just take that into account. We're not going to be super academic into this, but there is a reason. We want to be pragmatic. We want to make things the easiest possible so we can get the most maintainability out of it. So we said this is about custom code and business logic, and so we're going to start with how it would start in your day-to-day. Your stakeholder comes in and says, we have a new requirement, and it is very important that all books located in Area 51 are considered off limits. Don't ask, just do it. And you get right into it. You have a custom module called physical media, and you implement the node access hook. Like, if it feels perfect, you're already using typed entity. So you check if it's a book, and if not, you just bail. But if it is a book, then you get that repository manager that we talked about earlier. And here I'm using the service directly, but there is an approach that is a little bit nicer, that is just a helper method or a helper function that will return you that service, and it will give you type hinting for your IDE, etc. Because in IDE, the integration with an IDE is also part of maintainability. So this example is a little bit dated, but we'll see what is the helper method that goes and replaces this. But we get the repository manager, which is like a global object, and we pass it the node via the method wrap, and that will return the book. And if the book is findable, remember we implemented custom because we are already using typed entity. and we are declaring our objects capabilities through interfaces. If it's findable, you can find it, you can get the location, and if the building is Area 51, you return access forbidden, right? This is great. However, there are a couple improvements that we can make, and it's that we can still move the entity logic closer to the entity. In this approach, in this hook implementation, there is still stuff that is specific to this client or this ticket or this business need, right? And we have logic about book, right? We said that we are declaring our objects capabilities, so we can detect in the future things like if an object can do this and that. So let's leverage that, and instead of talking about a book, let's talk about objects that can be checked for access, right? That would be more generic and more pertaining to that particular hook. And then another thing that would give a hint is the string Area 51, right? That is super specific about this project, and it doesn't need to go into, we don't want our business logic scattered throughout our code base. We want it contained, right? And what we can do is we want to aim for a hook implementation that looks more like this. And in here, I'm already using that helper function that I told you, typed entity repository manager, which will return the same service. So we wrap it. We wrap the node. And we're not checking if it's a book or not. We're just wrapping it. And if there isn't a plugin for whatever that node is, if it's a book or if it's a whatever, if there is not a repository, we return access neutral. But if it is, we check, does this object, this wrapped entity, support checking for access? If so, check for its access. If not, return access neutral. And then we can go inside of the book class and say book implements accessible interface, and that will force us to implement the access method that we have down below. And this has a nice kind of side effect, or well, it's not a side effect, it's an intended effect. But it has the effect that you can reason about your code better, and you can discover and introspect your code better, because now you can click on the accessible interface and see all the list of the classes that implement that interface in particular. So it's easier to analyze your code from a static perspective. And to be more specific, it promotes better code organization. When you're writing the code, when you start with a ticket, you know where to implement the logic. Then you just call that logic from whatever hook, but you know where to implement the logic. So the code is organized and is predictable, and the developer that comes behind you knows where it will be, and you don't waste a lot of time trying to find where that thing is happening, right? It promotes better readability because you are writing your custom interfaces that are designed to be reusable across objects, and the authoring and discovery. The authoring and the discovery, I already talked about that. The class testability, we mentioned that in an earlier slide. You can now go and check and test all of the edge cases of your access checks and see if those perform as you would expect. It also improves the static analysis, which kind of piggyback on the discovery, and it furthers code reuse. So how does it work? Because we are here probably we are all developers that want to write better code. And if you're like me, to fully understand the concept, I want to learn how it's built. So let's take a look at that. Just a sec. Oh. All right. We said repositories are plugins, so this is the plugin. You just put the annotation name, the type repository, we specify, very important, the entity type ID and the bundle. And then you have a key called wrappers. And it has an annotation with class with variants. We'll see in a sec what that means. But the important part is that the fallback here, it has a reference to the book class that will contain all the business logic that applies to a single book instance. And that's pretty much it. Then you can start implementing the business logic specific for the repository. We said find by tags and the book operations, etc. But as you saw earlier, we often attach special behavior or business logic to entities with certain data or that are specific or special in a way or another that you don't have a way to encode statically. Things that depend on an editor filling out certain forms, certain fields in a certain way. I know, maybe calling an API. What if we want to add business logic that is specific to books that are bestsellers, but you only have selling data from an external API, right? That will be like an uncommon case, but still something that you might need. The kind of good example of this is the audiobook, as I said before, and how you construct that URL, or if you already served that URL to that user, stuff like that, that is specific to audiobooks and not all books. So how do we deal with that? Well, we have a way. In the wrappers key, we said that we have a class with variants. The class is a book, but the variants are the different cases that we saw, like the different, the diverging points of business logic. Like maybe it's a sci-fi book and has specific business logic, or a book with sounds. Then you can just specify the classes. How does type entity know when to create a bestseller book or just a plain old book? It does it via an applies method. So all variants, in order to be eligible for being used, they need to implement a specific interface, and that interface will force you to put this applies method. So there, what you will do is just return true or false. I am I have an entity with a context in general, and you check for properties or things in that context, properties in that entity, fields, or whatever, and you say yes, this applies for that for the class that that houses this method. In this case, if the field genre is science fiction, yes, this is a sci-fi book, and that's contained in sci-fi book.php. So the book repository will inspect all of the variants in order by one, and it will check for the applies method. And if it does apply, then it will return a book, like still with wavy lines, but in this case it's a little bit different. It's not a rectangle. In this case, it's around the circle, right? Still similar, but not exactly the same. Now, sci-fi book may implement different interfaces that book does not, right? And at this point, you could be tempted to think, and it would be awesome if you did, because that means that I have inspired this idea, or maybe you already had it, but you could be thinking, could type entity implement hooks for me? Like, imagine that there is a hook entity foo. Could type entity provide a hook entity foo implementation that checks if my typed entity is fooable, and if it is, then foo the bar with the data that was provided, right? And do that for all of the entity hooks that are known to humanity. And the answer is no and yes. No, because type entity doesn't want to replace the hook system, right? Type entity aims to improve or to help you improve your code base for maintainability, to have better quality that is cheaper. And cheaper in the terms of that takes you less to keep running, add features, modify, and in general is easier to work with. That's what I mean by cheaper. And for that, what I think is that you don't need, if type entity was to do this and implement hooks for you and replace the integration point from hooks to interfaces that you add to your wrappers, to your entity wrappers, type entity would need to take care of all of the features that all of the hooks add. And also, what are all of the hooks, right? Do we take into account contrib? Which contrib? The ones that are the top X thousand, or just a couple of them, right? So those are things that maybe we don't need to do, because you want your hooks and your implementations to be as simple as possible and to adapt to your particular use case. Just do the simplest in your code base and design the code in a way that if you need to change it in the future, if you need to evolve it or make it more complex, then you can just jump into that code. You know where it is, you know what it's doing, and then you can change it. And the goal is to make this, you know where it is, you know what it's doing, also known to future developers that may not have the same insights that you have when you wrote this. I said no and yes, and the yes part is that, as we said, we render entities as content in the screen, and I will argue that that is the most common use case that we do with entities. And that, combined with the fact that there is a natural way of checking for variants, and we call, when in the rendering process of an entity, we call those variants, we call them view modes, right? Those two facts make me think that we could do that. We could do that and provide a special type of entity wrapper called renderer. And it is just the same thing, but it is focused only on rendering logic. And it's not incompatible with regular wrappers. In fact, renderers will benefit from having regular wrappers. So let's see what that means. We are currently supporting these three hooks: entity view alter, preprocess, and entity display build alter, because those are, in my opinion, the most commonly used ones. But if you disagree, please feel free to create a merge request or a patch, and we'll add support. So we go from having to implement these hooks to use renderers. So how do we declare renderers? Just like we do with wrappers. we replace, or actually we have wrappers, we do the same thing, and we use the renderers key, and then we put the location of the classes or the fully qualified names of the classes for the renderers in this case. And here I kind of replaced the wrappers with the renderers. In your case, 90% of the time that you have renders, you will also have wrappers. But I wanted to show how this changes very little. Like if you understand wrappers, you understand renderers, or at least how to declare them. And then you basically create, let's say, the teaser for the book, and you extend from a certain render base class. And instead of using the applies method, now the base class has an applies method by default that uses the constant view mode, and it checks if the view mode that Drupal is requesting to render the entity teaser, then this class will be used, right? And then it will call for the pre-process, it will call for the view alter, and as you can see, these are very simple functions, and this is kind of the intention of the example here, but this is very easy to test, right? This is much easier to test than writing a test for the hook implementation. Oops, sorry. For these hook implementations, you just write the test for the pre-process method, and we can mock any of the dependencies or the arguments that you pass into it. So, in summary, and this is coming to an end, this presentation kind of invites you to use type entity as a way to organize your business logic, the custom logic that you write for the business that you work for, be your client or be your maybe you are the developer that's working directly for the end client. It invites you to encapsulate the business logic into a separate class that contains a reference to an entity. Those are called wrappers. It invites you to add variants in case that you have that need. Things like special data, maybe that checkbox that says this is the editor's pick, or the staff favorites, or whatever you call it. Those could be called variants and handle the logic differently, and this will kind of make it easier to understand what are the requirements just by looking at the code base, which is something that is very difficult to convey if you don't work in any specific way. And also has the concept of implementing hooks, services, events in a generic way by checking for interfaces in the wrappers instead of just assuming and implementing right there. And finally, we talk about the concept of renders, which are just a kind of a specific type of wrappers that are kind of a sibling of wrappers that use those concepts for render specific business logic, because that is so common and it's so much easier to deal with just renderers than glob everything inside of the entity wrapper, and use variants for renderers using view modes. So the goal is to make your entity business logic more testable, discoverable, maintainable, and readable. And that's it for me. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and ta-da!